It's 10 times the terror.
Hello and welcome to 10 Times the Terror.
Not okay.
Hello, this is Paul, and welcome to 10 Times the Terror.
And I'm Gwen.
And I want to talk today about a major film figure in both in mystery, horror, and suspense, and that is Basil Rathbone, who is probably the most famous person among portrayers of Sherlock Holmes. And we'll talk a little bit about that anyway. But Basil Rathbone is one of my favorite actors. He has 3 Walk of Fame blocks on Hollywood Boulevard in front of the Grauman's Chinese Theater. He's recognized for film, for theater, and for radio. So quite an expressive career. I was thinking about this. There's recently a film on Turner Classics was shown that I've never seen before. And it's a film in the early 40s. And Rathbone plays a mad doctor who's trying to get rid of the people who know his identity. He's taken the identity of a former doctor in Europe, and he's now in Chicago. And his modus operandi is axe murders.
Oh my God. Oh, so he's very villainous in this. Oh, he's probably good in it because he's such a good villain.
Yeah. He really, in the 1930s, was Hollywood's greatest villain. No question.
So this would have been right before the peak of his career, or?
It depends on how you define the peak. That's one reason we want to talk about this. Let me
Right.
just sort of go through some of the history of his career. I was reviewing that, and I have to say, was a very devout person of Christian faith. He was a lifelong Episcopalian. Originally grew up in the Anglican Church in England. He was born in 1892, actually in Johannesburg, South Africa.
Oh,
But
wow.
grew up in England, and in his early years became a notable stage performer. And the big hit in his early development was the leading female actress of the time, a woman named Catherine Cornell. I was very impressed with him, and she played Juliet to his Romeo, and they
Oh.
toured through the United States as well as in Great Britain, and that's what got him attention in the U.S. First in theater, and he said his primary love was theater more so than film or radio, even though he got recognized in the Walk of Fame for those, but again, Shakespeare was his particular favorite, and his favorite role was Romeo. And he had a very distinctive look, but he was handsome, and not in a kind of conventional way. Somebody said once that his face was like two side faces put together, two profiles. I think that was what I was saying. 2 profiles just stamped together,
He definitely has a distinct profile.
Oh, absolutely. So he had several appearances on Broadway in the 1920s, and also then appeared in some silent films in England in the silent era, and began with some talking films in America. His voice was very sharp, very distinctive, so he was ideal for sound cinema, although his acting skills were such that I'm sure I have never seen any of his silent films, but I'm sure they're very good, and they include some classic works like The School for Scandal, which parenthetically was a play I was in college. Main difference being that Rathbone was talented and famous, and I wasn't. but
Small difference.
It's that. Yeah, the costume thing is a reality. When you're dressing in 18th century dress, it does give you a different feel. And Rathbone was very adept at playing into these costume roles. Okay, well, here we go. 1930, he got the role of a then popular detective named Philo Vance. Now, Philo Vance is pretty much unknown today, but in the 1920s and 30s, he was very popular, and there were any number of films of his stories, his cases, if you will. William Powell was a very famous Philo Vance. Well, in 1930, Basil Rathbone played Philo Vance, which is interesting because Philo Vance was a New Yorker, so Rathbone had to adjust his accent a little bit. But there is a scene in that film, which I've seen years ago, but there is a moment in the film where Rathbone as Philo Vance, alongside of the district attorney, are walking into a room, and one of the characters looks at them and jokingly says, "Oh, here comes Holmes and Watson,"
Oh my gosh, it's so funny.
prefiguring by 9 years. And when you look at this film, you have to say, why in heaven's name did it take Hollywood 9 years to cast him as Sherlock Holmes?
Was the film really successful, or was it one of those kind of just
No,
cranking it out?
it was an MGM film, probably not one of their biggest films, but it's from a very major studio. So
Yeah.
and the series was popular. They kept making Philo Vance movies. That Basil Rathbone only did that one, but basically they would
Interesting.
seem to be popular. Well, then what begins to happen is that Rathbone gets cast in costume roles and classical dramas, and shows off his versatility. But he becomes really typecast initially as a villain, and
I
he is
see.
a great villain.
Oh, he's
So all
fantastic.
through the 30s, he's in major film after major film. He's the sadistic Mr. Murdstone in David Copperfield. He's the
He's so
Count de
scary.
Evermond in A Tale of Two Cities, where he has the great line after his carriage has run over a kid and killed him. His comment is, "Who knows what harm you may have done to my horses?"
Wow.
He's a swashbuckler villain, played opposite Errol Flynn twice, and had duels with him. Played opposite Tyrone Power in The Mark of Zorro. He was pilot in The Last Days of Pompeii.
Oh,
Yeah, it's just film after film. He was in a film, Adventures of Marco Polo, with Gary Cooper, and he definitely was the go-to guy for being a villain. Now he began to resent that, and apparently he was under contract to MGM where this was exactly in the scheme of things, but he's in a film called The Garden of Allah, and he's sort of this mysterious Arabian figure.
okay.
And but he's told David O. Selznick, "I don't want to do any more villains. I've done all these different kinds of villains." And Rathbone is actually himself was a very good fencer. That was his favorite sport. He made the joke. He said, "I could have killed Errol Flynn or Tyrone Power anytime I wanted to. Just they had the script on their
Well,
side."
he definitely is very good in those fighting scenes.
Oh yeah. He's terrific. Well, anyway, apparently, in the Garden of Allah, they're doing a scene here, and Rathbone saw that they were making him more of a villainous character, and he was furious.
Oh.
And he apparently went in and confronted Selznick in his office or wherever and said, "You promised me that this would be a character role, not a villain. And now in this scene, you're setting my character up as a villain." So in a prophetic sense, he said, "I don't want to be typecast." Okay. Well, that kind of comes back to haunt him, as we'll talk about this in another way here. So he's in all these different kind of films. Then he kind of gravitates, because of being a villain, into horror films. By 1936, horror films had pretty much ceased production in Hollywood because there was such a negative reaction to them, and this was with the wake of the production code being enforced.
Right.
So, and especially all the films with Boris Karloff and Bela Lugosi, and so they were pretty much not being made anymore. All right, and those actors who were purely doing horror were out of work. Not Rathbone. He appears in a version of Romeo and Juliet, in which he's nominated for an Academy Award. A couple of years later, like in 1938, he plays the King of France in a great character role in If I Were King, about the French poet Francois Villon. Again, gets nominated for an Academy Award. ironically, he lost both times to Walter Brennan, who's sort of a very folksy American kind of character. Be that as it may. But so Rathbone in the 30s is at the peak of his fame and influence, and that's where he can talk back to a David O. Selznick, who already, even before Gone with the Wind, was a huge character. Now, Gone with the Wind, let's get talking about that. We want to talk about how much Rathbone's star was. Apparently, now this is again is conjecture. Apparently, this has been cited that Margaret Mitchell herself, author of Gone with the Wind, wanted him for the part of Rhett Butler.
Really?
Yes. And
It's a
again,
very
you have to understand,
picture.
when you go back and look at the book Gone with the Wind, Rhett Butler is a more ambiguous character. He's kind of a nasty character in many ways.
Uh-huh.
Whereas that, of course, got softened with Clark Gable, and again, Gable was perfect, but Gable was not a literal Rhett Butler, and many times that's not the case. That
Yeah.
you're literally portraying somebody. But that's how high Rathbone's star was in the late 1930s.
Amazing.
You know, being nominated for Academy Awards, getting these major parts, playing Shakespeare, and also getting recognized, for character roles, and trying to break it now out of his villainous roles. Okay, back about the horror film, and we talked about that, and that becomes part of this history.
Had he already done Son of Frankenstein?
No. You're getting ahead of me, sweetie.
Oh, sorry.
Okay, so horror films ceased production about 1936. It had 5-year run, very popular but very controversial at the time. Unfortunately, because these were great horror films that were being made. Some of the classics, Best, Dr. Jekyll, Mr. Hyde, which won Frederick March an Academy Award. Of course, the Frankenstein, Dracula, Bride of Frankenstein. Outstanding films by our standards historically. But at the time, there was protest even from church groups and women's auxiliaries and all of this, that this was too much in some of these films, especially the ones with Karloff and Lugosi, which would just kind of went over the top, but were still very effective. Okay, the summer of 1938, right? That things are a little better in terms of the Depression. America started coming out of the Depression more. And a studio in downtown Los Angeles, I guess it was, trying to find something more for revenue, whatever, booked Frankenstein and Dracula, the original films, Boris Karloff and Bela Lugosi, respectively, books that for a summer series. Well, the lines are apparently out the theater, down the block, and around the corner of people who wanted, and this is a reissue now of Frankenstein and Dracula. But with this tremendous response, Universal, who made both those films, look at this and saying, wow, there's obviously a market here. We need to do let's try another horror film. Okay, so they come up with one of the biggest budgeted horror films of that era, which was Son of Frankenstein. And their first choice for the title role is Peter Lorre. But then Lorre kind of drops out, and they say, you know who we really should get for this is Basil Rathbone.
He's fantastic in this.
Yeah, and his character to me is very inconsistent. It's not his fault. I think it's poorly written. That he brings the monster back to life, but then when the monster goes on a killing spree, he doesn't really come forward and say what's going on, especially when his assistant obviously gets killed by them. Anyway, but he redeems himself. Point is, this is a film that had the major horror film stars of the early 30s in supporting roles: Boris Karloff, Bela Lugosi, and Lionel Atwill, who was in Mystery of the Wax Museum and his other films. But the top billing went to Basil Rathbone. Okay, the film was a huge success. So in Hollywood then as now, when a film is a success, what do?
Make another one.
Do it over again. Either do a sequel
They
or a
got the same
remake. Or something.
formula.
Okay, yeah. So here you've got Basil Rathbone as Dr. Frankenstein, Boris Karloff as the monster, top billing. So somebody and you have Rathbone here also with his role of having been in these adventure films, in costume dramas, with Robin Hood and Captain Blood and so forth. So the next thing that Universal does, and they tried this as a big budget item, given the fact that Son of Frankenstein was so successful, they do a film called Tower of London
I've
about
never seen that.
the notorious Richard III, who
Oh,
was by legend, also by Shakespeare, was this brutal king who killed all of his rivals, including two young children. And his henchman is the person who's the Axeman, who's the chief executioner for all of his enemies, and who plays that? But Boris Karloff.
mm.
Also in the cast is a young Vincent Price.
Oh wow.
Okay, so we've got that going. And now the World War II has begun, and there's a cutting back on films that can be shown in the obviously in Europe with all of this. But Rathbone gets cast in another film from Paramount, and these are prestige studios again. Paramount and MGM especially, more so than Universal. But he gets cast in a film called, are you ready for this? The Mad Doctor.
Oh.
And has this really a wild. It was one wild scene where he pushes a guy off a subway platform.
Oh my goodness.
Yeah, so he's getting this image now, and this is like an extension of the image of him being a villain. Now we're getting into the horror films series, which he's not happy with that image. Not happy with that. But hey, that's the big roles he's getting right at this point. Okay. So in fact, there's a Bob Hope movie in this period called Ghost Catchers, and there's a scene where there's a thunderstorm going on, lightning and crashing thunder and so forth. And Hope says, "Wow, Basil Rathbone must be having a party." So give that in. So all of this is preludes. We have Rathbone as the classical actor. We have Rathbone as the chief villain with all kinds of costume parts and playing Dickens and Shakespeare and all the rest of that, and getting nominated for Academy Awards. We have Rathbone also now being seen in the horror film genre. Okay, so you got all these multiple roles. Now it gets really interesting. It shouldn't be surprising. There's supposedly a famous lunch in Hollywood, 1938, with Darryl F. Zanuck and leaders at 20th Century Fox, looking for new properties. What should we do next? And the suggestion comes up: let's do a Sherlock Holmes film. But let's not. But up to that point, I mean, there have been plenty of Sherlock Holmes films and different, and of course, very famous actors. John Barrymore played Holmes in a silent film, but they were always set in the period in which they were filmed, not in the Victorian era in which they take place in the literary sources. All right. So the thought was there, look, let's do a big budget one and set it in the Victorian period. Horses and carriages and gas lights and all of that kind of thing. So now they decide what they're going to do, the most famous and challenging Holmes story, which is The Hound of the Baskervilles. Already been filmed multiple times, but they're looking to do this, and Zanuck is a showman. If you go back and look at the career, all the things that he produces, he's really one of the major moguls, one of the major producers in Hollywood history. And the question comes up apparently in this lunch meeting, well, who should we get to play Sherlock Holmes? And the answer comes back, well, who else but Basil Rathbone? Okay.
Of course. Who else? I mean,
who
perfect.
Else? Yeah. So Rathbone is signed on to be Holmes. Nigel Bruce is signed on to be Watson, and so they have some which is is a quasi horror film because the figure of the title is supposed to be a supernatural hellhound. Now, in the story,
Right.
there's the killer who's got a vicious dog that's going to play the part. But that's the character, and then what's being presented is this supernatural idea. This is still in the era in which horror films have not been produced for several years. Son of Frankenstein has not yet come out when they're having this luncheon discussion. So there's a kind of hedging of the bets on doing the film. And so the film is multifaceted. It's not as good as it could be, given the talent I think that goes into it. And that comment's been made by a number of people. It was unavailable for a number of years because of copyright problems, and then was re-released to theaters in the mid-1970s. And again, was a big hit all over again. Sparked the whole Sherlock Holmes revival. Oddly enough, the leading actor in the film is not Basil Rathbone. He's second billed. The leader is a guy named Richard Green, who's an unknown figure now, but was kind of a matinee idol figure for 20th Century Fox back in that day. And your grandmother, Gwendolyn, told me once that when she was 14, she had a big crush on him.
Oh my gosh. Well, this is my favorite Hound of the Baskervilles. This version, I think, is the best one, which we can debate another time. This one's fantastic.
I would say the best Sherlock Holmes movie, but having Rathbone in it. So
yeah,
it comes out, and in the first film, establishes Rathbone as the Holmes. I say we've had plenty of really good performers of Holmes, in the 70, 80 years since Rathbone stopped making the films, which then went back to more the conventional theatrical version, where you didn't make the film follow the stories literally. They're most of them short stories, but you used kind of themes from them and create basically a very melodramatic, kind of setting. So and Universal is then in the golden age, the silver age of horror, which is inaugurated by Basil Rathbone. They're not dumb. They see that this Hound of the Baskervilles was a huge hit, followed almost immediately by what many consider actually also possibly the best Sherlock Holmes film of all time, The Adventures of Sherlock Holmes. Again, set in the Victorian period, with the great George Zucco as Professor Moriarty, Ida Lupino as the threatened heroine. Great stuff. So
out of the gate, just big hits with the Sherlock Holmes choices.
Right. So Universal says, forget just, we'll do the monsters. We'll do Frankenstein, Dracula, Wolfman, but we've got to do Sherlock Holmes. And their idea is to make this a quasi kind of a hybrid mystery horror series, because they're resurrecting the horror film. And all of a sudden, whatever concerns people had, they kind of go by the wayside. And Universal is back in the horror film business with Son of Frankenstein, followed up with The Wolfman, and they're off and running with all of these films and bringing back Karloff and Lugosi in different parts and so forth. But the idea there then is that they're going to merge the Sherlock Holmes stuff in with some of the horror stuff. And again, purists were kind of upset, but those films were very successful. They include The Scarlet Claw, which has Holmes set in Canada, but it's very atmospheric, probably the best one of the Universal films. Also, The Spider Woman and The Pearl of Death, where Holmes encounters the Oxton Creeper, who breaks people's backs. And you look up the story that's based on, The Six Napoleons, and the murderer is described as being almost ape-like in his appearance. Well, it's poor Rondo Hatton, who played the Creeper, suffered from acromegaly, a disease that did distort your features, and he died somewhat prematurely. But he played that role in several films. But the first one is with Basil Rathbone and Sherlock Holmes. Meanwhile, this is still pre-television, but radio is probably the dominant form of entertainment, even more so than movies, because radio you had in your own home. Well, next thing you know, there's now a a radio series of Sherlock Holmes starring Basil Rathbone and Nigel Bruce. Okay.
Wow, and at the same time as the films were coming out.
The same time the films are coming out, right?
Oh, I've never heard the radio ones.
Yeah, no, I've heard that, and it also shows, the one dramatization of Holmes that Conan Doyle himself did. People would complain about, Watson, he's made look like a bungling fool, in these movies and stuff. Well, I think that's overstated because he rescues Holmes any number of times,
Right. I personally completely disagree with that take. I think that he is the best Watson. I think they have the best chemistry. And I think he's one of the only memorable Watsons of all the different times that they've done the Holmes series.
Well, get this. When William Gillette was the first one to do a dramatization of Holmes, and he was, and we now can see his film. It was his. He did a play at the very end of the 19th century that was a huge hit, both sides of the Atlantic. 1916, he filmed the play. Of course, it's silent, but you get a chance to see him. And then he's followed up by John Barrymore and a bunch of others. Now, though, you go back and look at those early films, which are based more on the play than they were on the stories, because it's a dramatic form. But what happens is the stories are narrated by Watson. Well, when you're doing a stage play or a movie, you don't need a narrator.
Exactly.
So the character of Watson gets diminished. And when you look at both the Gillette film and the John Barrymore film, Watson is sort of a background figure, really.
Yeah. He's not really necessary to, like you said, his role is the narrator in the books. So when you take that away, the
narrator in a play or a movie. Then but the other thing then, and we're more coming to several points here. Other thing is in The Hound of the Baskervilles, when this is done, it's about Rathbone only gets second billing. Nigel Bruce as Watson gets fourth billing. Fourth, because Wendy Barry, who's the love interest, she's like the third billing.
Third.
Yeah. Okay. That's the last time an actor playing Watson got fourth billing. So in a lot of ways, Nigel Bruce rescues the character from being insignificant or just a backhanded reference figure that Holmes can work with. And Doyle did one story or one play. He did the Speckled Band and wrote it as a play that adapted. So he's adapting his own story.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Now he had already seen this. This is about 1910. He's seeing what's happening with the character of Watson. So what does he do to give Watson some more attention? He gives him comic business,
which makes sense. And like you said, Nigel Bruce, his character, yes, it has the bumbling and the goofy, but he's saving Holmes countless times. You clearly see his medical skills constantly being used,
right,
as
that's
a doctor.
True. Yeah, he really is a doctor.
Yeah, he has that sympathetic ear to victims that Holmes doesn't necessarily bring. I disagree with anyone that hates on Nigel Bruce as Watson.
Yeah, no. Well, get this. The radio series was going on. They decided they're going to do the Speckled Band, which is probably the most famous short story in the Holmes canon, Holmes series. And I've heard that. But when they did the radio play, they said, why are we going to do our own version? A version already exists, the one that Doyle himself did. So they go back and get the script of the play that Doyle had did and use that for the radio play. And it is dead on perfect for both Rathbone and Bruce.
I rest my case.
Yeah. So that's one reason. That's how that totally works out. And Gillette had made Holmes kind of more of an action figure because again, it was for theater, and that clearly gets picked up in the Universal series with Basil Rathbone. He's like Dick Tracy or something, always being tied up or thrown out, buried in a chest of tools, and thrown into the river, all kinds of stuff. that he has to be rescued from. And you're right, Watson is the one who's usually rescuing him.
Yeah.
So he is, and again, he's not a literal Holmes. I think Peter Cushing is actually closer to the Holmes in the book, but he's a dramatic Holmes that comes out of the theatrical versions, not the literary ones.
Mm-hmm.
So the first several films have a World War II setting, and it's like, how could you not? World War II is going on, and it's not resolved. And in fact, Doyle wrote a spy story with Sherlock Holmes in World War I, and that gets updated to be the first film in the Universal series, Sherlock Holmes and the Voice of Terror.
Which is so good. That's probably the best one, in my opinion, of all of the films.
Oh, really? Okay.
Well, because Evelyn Anchors in that film in particular, her speech at the bar when she like rallies the guys, and just something about it, that one like hits me where I just enjoy it the most.
Yeah, and the film ends with the dialogue from the short story, where Holmes says to Watson, "There's an east wind blowing, Watson, and many of us may wither in its blast, but it's God's own wind, and a stronger, cleaner nation will emerge from the conflict," or something, words to that effect.
Yeah.
Okay, but people started saying by the time he's doing Sherlock Holmes in Washington, it's like, yeah, are we? What happened to the real Sherlock Holmes?
Yeah.
So they then went to doing some more films based on the story. Excuse me. Based on the stories. The next one they did was based on the Musgrave Ritual, which is a very famous story, and they retitled it Sherlock Holmes Faces Death, get it a little more melodramatic and stuff.
Right.
Okay, so these films are not perfect, but they are important, and they are very well done, and they're incredibly atmospheric. And your cousin Tim, who's doing film stuff, he really he said he thought they were really terrific. I gave him a set of them when I went from.
Yeah. Well, especially when you got that set, that was re-rasterized, like where the black was real crisp and the contrast was just fantastic versus the betas and the VHSs where it was all kind of just different shades of grays. It was really dynamic.
Right. Absolutely. Yeah. So, and it's the films that have been restored by UCLA, and they are available. They're available on Blu-ray. And you're right. And there's that great scene in The Voice of Terror where there's just this pool of light and everything is total darkness, and Holmes and Watson and this other guy are in the light, but they can't see anything around them, and all that's on a hand holding a gun comes out from the darkness. All you see is the hand and the gun. You don't see the person yet.
You can't see anything past the wrist. It's so good.
Yeah, all right. So, but now from 1939 to 46, think of this. Rathbone has done 2 major Holmes films set in period. He's done 12 of the Universal series, and he's done over 200 radio plays, radio shows.
All as Holmes?
All as Holmes.
Wow.
And basically what he says in his own autobiography is like, I felt like my career was over. I was losing my identity. So he said, my touring as Shakespeare, my 2 Academy Award nominations, and all this stuff are all kind of like been forgotten. And he appears in one period piece in this period time called Frenchman's Creek, but basically his career is largely over because nobody can see of him as anything but Sherlock Holmes.
That's so sad.
Well, and it gets worse. Okay, I tell you this. He said, okay, if I'm not getting the films from Hollywood, I'm going back to the theater, which was his first love. So he's on Broadway in this play, The Heiress, which is based on a Henry James story. He plays this sort of domineering father, It is got kind of gaslight overtones, you know. Yeah, but it's you know, it's theater, and again, he is kind of a malevolent character. Well, he gets nominated for a Tony. Okay, he wins the Tony, Best Actor. Okay, now the play rather being so successful, they're going to do a film version of it, and they sign on with people, and they deliberately do not sign on Rathbone. They get another actor to play his part.
That makes no sense. He just won the Tony for it. What, like,
Yeah.
why would they do that?
I think their attitude was Rathbone is Sherlock Holmes to everybody.
Wow.
Whatever you put him in, and so you know, and what's left for him are some horror films, which are okay, some of very dubious quality. You know, you've always got this kind of thing, you know, where you've got this Holmes piece. So he has a couple of appearances in some significant films, very few, and basically he's an out of work actor by the time we get into the 1950s, and he's done you know, a few minor kind of horror films and stuff like that, but he does do something that made a big impression on me. He goes on tour, which is something he had done in especially his theater roles, especially Shakespeare. Goes on tour with a program called An Evening with Basil Rathbone, and he appeared at Montclair State back in the early '60s with this program, and I went to see it. You know, so there I saw him in the flesh.
Wow.
It was so great. And
Was it like a one show?
Yeah, An Evening with Basil Rathbone. Right. He comes out. I remember he lights a candle and then he just talks. You know, tells about his past and tells about it. And that's part one. And then part two is all Shakespeare. And because it was getting
seems
late.
like he really had a love for Shakespeare.
Yeah. Oh yeah, absolutely. He ends in some of these poverty road or some of these really schlocky movies. You know, The Ghost in the Invisible Bikini.
No,
In the
Basil.
1960s. And who's his
Oh.
co-star? Make it more painful. Boris Karloff.
Oh, it's just so sad.
And you have the obligatory moment where he comes walking in, and one of the characters says to another one, "Hey, that guy looks just like Sherlock Holmes."
No, isn't that interesting though? That didn't you say that was kind of a joke in one of the beginning detective films of his career,
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
now again at the end of his career, it's like this odd full circle.
And his last film, I never could bring myself to watch. Here's the title: Hillbillies
Uh-oh.
in a Haunted House.
Oh gosh. Oh gosh. Don't tell me he has the hillbilly accent in it.
I think he's, you know, like a bad guy who's trying to haunt the house to keep people out. I don't know. You know, I just decided, as much as I love, and I would call Basil Rathbone one of my all-time favorite actors. It's just sad to see, you know, the end like this.
Yeah, and I feel bad that Holmes like ruined his career when it was such a perfect fit. It was such a perfect role for him, but at the same time, it shouldn't have been the only thing for him.
Yeah. You know, he played Scrooge in a radio play and in a TV version. You know, he did little odds and ends, but you know, basically, after Holmes, he's not in any major films. You know, there's no blockbusters, which would have been like David Copperfield or Robin Hood, or you know, these enormously big productions, all-star cast and so forth. You know, so you know, he did do some horror films that were okay, you know, good enough, but he wasn't happy with them, and I think it was he really he was an out of work actor, you know, and that's why did this kind of just solo stage presentation. He even did it at Montclair High, you know, and you know, you see people trying to train. Again, this is it would make a very occasional appearances and things, but yeah, it was he never was an actor per se after Sherlock Holmes. He was always Sherlock Holmes. And
Very
as far as I'm concerned, he's the best Sherlock Holmes in the history of theater or theater, TV, or film.
I would agree with that.
Jeremy Brett, Benedict Cumberbatch. I mean, there's all kinds of major actors. Robert Downey Jr.
There's really good Holmeses out there, but I definitely would consider him number one.
Yeah, it's right. When he goes out on the moor with the famous hat and the coat, is just, it's perfection, and he's shooting the hound. Yeah, right.
Yeah. Did you ever find out? I forget which one it is, but do you remember where we always talked about this? There's a scene where he goes to grab the deersucker hat and stuff, and Watson goes, no, Holmes, like you promised, and he's like, okay, and he does, and he takes a different coat. Did we ever find out what that was?
No, I asked Tom Weaver, who's like the leading authority on horror mystery films and stuff. And Tom Weaver, in his history of the Universal horror films, includes all of the Sherlock Holmes films.
Right.
And I asked him, and he said there are some of these questions in film history that nobody has an answer to, because
right.
everybody who's involved was long since passed away.
Right. It can be something so minor as like an inside joke or something.
Yeah. When you look at the other films in the series, and you see that the coat hat, the coat hanger thing, you see the hat, it's there.
Yeah.
He never puts it on.
Yeah. I wonder what that all was about.
Well, it's like the question of why does Marilyn Monroe quote so much from The Creature from the Black Lagoon in 7-Year Itch?
That's also a good point. I feel like there was a rabbit hole of conspiracy theories around that too.
Yeah, it's again, we discussed that with Tom Weaver too. Again, he's the guy he's interviewed everybody you can get their hands on, and he said it makes no sense. He said, because the fact is, it couldn't help promote the film because the film had already had its run by the time 7-Year Itch came out. They were the same year, but so it's like, and it's not by the same studio, so why,
all I can contribute to is some kind of inside jokes happening between either writers or cast members or the actors themselves or something.
Yeah, something, whatever. To sort of wrap it up, Basil Rathbone is a name worth remembering. Even though he's definitely going to always be Sherlock Holmes, he wasn't only Sherlock Holmes, and I think that's kind of. And I give Turner Classics credit for showing this movie that I'd heard about, but I've never seen, called Fingers at the Window, where he's playing the guy with the axe murders. Right?
Wow.
And that fits into the the horrors trajectory of him, but it goes off in all kinds of different directions, and there's just so many great roles he played in. He was really one of Hollywood's greatest actors.
Yeah. Oh, definitely. And super talented. He was just a very talented actor.
Yeah, right. It's just, you wish that he could have had more vehicles attuned to his talents.
Yeah.
And because he said after a while, he said, I became bored playing Sherlock Holmes. It was the same thing over and over and over again,
Right.
Elementary, my dear Watson. There you go. But that never comes across, I think, in any of the films. He's too much of a professional,
right,
to act like he's just sort of going through the motions. Yeah, well, the fact that he's got three dedications in the Hollywood Walk of Fame does signify some real appreciation for him. Most people, it's impressive to have one. He had 3.
Yeah. Amazing.
Okay, well, I think that kind of wraps that up, sweetie. What do you think?
Yep.
Yeah, well, you're right. We're going to be looking forward to hearing some more things, and my older daughter is going to be giving her thoughts on The Silence of the Lambs, is her favorite horror film. So there'll be a lot more to look forward to. And this has been 10 Times the Terror. This is Paul.
And I'm Gwen.
And it's been great being with you, and we'll see you next time.
Thank you for listening to
It's 10 times the terror.
the podcast.
One of my favorite films ever. Let's do that for you. Thank you for listening to 10 Times the Terror. This podcast would not be possible without listeners like you. You can find out more about our podcast by visiting our website, 10timestheterror.com. That's 10xtheterror.com.